Well, first of all, I do resent performing after those performers. Not a good move. You put me in a very difficult position because they were absolutely stunning. But do let me start with a few formal acknowledgements. Of course, Mr. Andrew Baxter, Chairman of the Foundation, I am very conscious of the work that chairs and board members put into organisations such as this, and you are amongst our finest volunteers, so it's lovely to have the opportunity to thank you all for that. And I'm conscious there are not only current board members here but also former board members and chairs, and they've put in such an enormous amount. Ms. Catherine Brown, of course, Chief Executive Officer, and I'm looking forward to hearing what you say a little later as well, and all distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. I want to start too by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we're gathering, and by paying my respects to elders past and present, and to any elders in the room with us today. This Lord Mayor's Charitable Fund is a wonderful force for social inclusion in this city, and I'm so delighted to be with you this morning. That is with one reservation. I did what you shouldn't do, and I looked up the previous speakers and the previous topics of this oration, and of course my heart sank, as it always does. And I saw that Michael Northrop from the Rockefeller Brothers Fund had given his oration on the role of philanthropy in creating sustainable cities, and that Gillian Triggs quite recently had given her oration on human rights and philanthropy. My reservation is that, of course, I'm not an expert on philanthropy, and I certainly can't talk from any specialised perspective in a way that those who've gone before me appear to have been able to speak. And I certainly can't offer anything on policy or, up to the moment, world-class evidence-based practice, or anything about legislative or tax incentives for philanthropists. That said, it did occur to me that as the Governor of Victoria, in fact, I do have a very privileged vantage point from which I can talk about philanthropy, because in this role, I have the opportunity to see the variety and the impact of philanthropic work, and how philanthropy underpins much of what makes Victoria, Victoria. I have a keener appreciation than ever in this role that philanthropy is not just an added extra for our state. It's not just the icing on the cake, it is the cake. Victoria would just not be Victoria without philanthropy. And although the title for today's oration is Inspiring Philanthropy, there's definitely also philanthropy, as well as philanthropy that inspires, I think Victoria's prosperity is underpinned by what I'd call inspired philanthropy. We in Victoria have been particularly enriched by giving that has been born of great vision, and that is vision accompanied by structures that have made it sustainable and capable of being built upon with the passage of time. In other words, we've been the beneficiaries of philanthropy that has enhanced the long-term well-being of our community. That's particularly front of mind this morning when I think of the Lord Mayor's Charitable Foundation, because that's something that you have done so very, very well. I want to talk this morning about several examples of individual and collective inspiring and inspired philanthropy. When we think about enduring philanthropic legacies of individuals in Victoria, we can choose from a very long list of names. But for me, it's hard not to start with Alfred Felton, the flesh and blood man who has perhaps faded a little behind the phrase so beloved by art lovers and administrators, the Felton bequest. Alfred Felton's story is such a classic story of 19th century Victoria. He was born in East Anglia in 1831, and he came to Melbourne with little more than some training as a chemist, but just in time for the gold rush. For several years, he carted goods to the goldfields, before he became a merchant and opened a wholesale druggist's business in Swanston Street. With the gold rush boom and the absolutely frenetic growth in this colony, his business activities expanded, and with very shrewd acquisitions, he moved into chemicals, glass manufacturing and pastoral interests, quite a diverse portfolio. But he lived very modestly. He never married. I don't mean that's the modest part, but sorry. It's not that it's, a negative financial impact if you marry, but he never married. He lived out his final years in simple rooms in St Kilda's Espy Hotel, quite a different use of the Espy from nowadays, surrounded just by his treasures of art. He died with a fortune equivalent today of something like $80 million, so it was huge. Now, of course, Victoria's lucky to have had many generous citizens, but what Felton had that I referred to a moment ago was the vision to go with his wealth, and it was shown by two particular bequests in his will. The first, the one that we know about most, of course, was his bequest to the Melbourne Gallery, later the NGV. It represented a community building optimism that is so striking in our early philanthropists. Felton was part of a generation who was motivated by great civic pride. So, of course, you know that following the gold rush, we were the wealthiest colony in the world. We managed to lose that later, and then we've managed to pick up terrific growth more recently. But in those days, it's interesting that the business and community leaders wanted to furnish their young colony and its expanding capital with the institutions that they considered absolutely essential to a civilised society: libraries, universities, symphony orchestras and museums. Felton's bequest to the gallery was specifically given to support the well-being of the community. His will made that very, very clear. He specified that the money for the gallery was to be spent on works, as he put it, with artistic and educative value. Works that were, again, words from his will, calculated to raise or improve the level of public taste. Now, I know nowadays the Edwardian notion of improving public taste sounds a bit old-fashioned, little politically incorrect even, but in fact we'd probably say it's embarrassingly patronising. However, what a brilliant vision at that stage in the life of Victoria. A good vision, a strong vision, although expressed in words of its time, is an enduring vision. And Felton's vision, I think, passes that test with absolutely flying colours. We really need to ask, would our NGV have become the country's leading gallery without Felton? Without the art from his bequest, now valued at some $2 billion? Would Victorians be educated to art, have an appetite to see more, and have the pride in their gallery without those rich underpinnings? And more broadly, without Felton's generosity in establishing such an important collection here, would the NGV today draw the exhilarating international shows that it draws? Exhibitions such as Van Gogh's masterpieces, garnering more than 420,000 visitors, as it did earlier this year. And could our gallery possibly have become the 19th most visited gallery anywhere in the world? Think about that statistic. We live on the opposite side of the world to most of the galleries and most of the old galleries and the incredibly rich galleries. And we come in 19th as the most visited. We have exactly the appreciation for art that Felton hoped we would have when he left that generous bequest in his will. So I think the answer is very, very clear. His bequest laid a cultural cornerstone for Melbourne. We're now a UNESCO City of Literature. We have one of the oldest international film festivals. The first symphony orchestra in the country was founded here. We're the city that attracted the famous Italian Arts Festival from Spoleto to our shores more than 3 decades ago, and the city that's just been chosen to feature its design prowess at the Hong Kong Business of Design Week next year, following Chicago, Stockholm, and they're about to have Italy this year. Not bad company for us to be keeping. So, do I sound a little bit parochial? Because if I do, I make no apology. It's my job and my absolute desire to sound that parochial, because I do think we are the arts centre of Australia, and hopefully right up there in the region. And it's thanks to that vision that we saw from the Felton bequest. The part that people know less about when it comes to Alfred Felton is that half of his fortune was directed to charities supporting the poor, the women, and children in need. It's another gift that keeps on quietly giving to the people of Victoria. In 2004, during centenary celebrations for the bequest, Sir Gus Nossal, who'd been on the bequests committee then for some 35 years, said, and I quote, "It's the Felton bequest's work in the charitable sector of which I am perhaps most proud." That bequest continues to distribute sums approaching $1 million each year to different innovative programs, tackling problems such as aged care for the homeless, child welfare and prisoner rehabilitation programs. In this financial year, the bequest has committed $250,000 to Fitted for Work's She Works program, which helps disadvantaged women find and keep meaningful work. Many of you will be familiar with it. Well, when Alfred Felton made this bequest, the speed of growth and change in late 19th century post-gold rush Melbourne had produced its fair share of social problems, and many Victorians, despite the wealth, were living in dire need. Times and social circumstances have completely changed, but Alfred Felton, although he might not have envisaged a charity that would assist women to have something appropriate to wear back to work or would assist women to stay in paid work, it's his vision that's enabled the programs to change with the times so that the community still gets the sort of help that he thought was so important, although for different reasons back then. Another philanthropist whose vision has helped shape this state is one that I'm sure you've heard about in every sense, and no doubt in the course of these orations too, and that's Dame Elisabeth Murdoch. There's actually a little link with Alfred Felton, because Dame Elisabeth was the first female trustee of the NGV, so she would have had many occasions to reflect on Felton's great gift to the Victorian people, which is a nice little overlap. Although I know that Dame Elisabeth has been fondly remembered and celebrated by many other speakers because she touched on so many different aspects of Victorian life, I want to mention just 2 this morning. Perhaps it's for her contributions to medical research and children's health that succeeding Victorians can be most grateful. Dame Elisabeth became interested in children's health when she was just a girl herself. Somehow I always imagined that it was once she was grown up and in a position to give this sort of help that she became engaged. But just at the age of 16, then Miss Elizabeth Green knitted a record number of baby jumpers for the Children's Hospital, and her prize was a guided tour of the hospital. The sight of small children crying as they came out of theatre, in her own words, devastated her. It sparked her lifelong passion for supporting medical and scientific research, and she supported it in the fullest sense. As Dame Elisabeth told Andrew Denton during a very rare interview many years later, "If you've got money, it's perfectly easy to give it away and nothing to be particularly proud of. But it's being involved and knowing you're helping and really being committed. It's very rewarding when you feel that you're making a difference to the lives of other people." Dame Elisabeth was certainly committed. She was, of course, heavily involved with the Royal Children's Hospital. It's an extraordinary thought that when she retired from her role as president of the hospital back in 1965, although she'd already clocked up 3 decades of service in different capacities to the hospital, she was aged only mid-50s. So she just did an extraordinary job while she was still a very young woman. But she was really only just getting started. Perhaps the most visionary of all her contributions to the health of Victorians was the Murdoch Institute, now the wonderful Murdoch Children's Research Institute, which she helped establish back in 1987. And I think that it's the Murdoch that shows best how far-sighted her philanthropy could be. Together with the inaugural director, Professor David Danks, who'd originally foreseen this concept of an independent research institute to study genetic disorders affecting children, Dame Elisabeth was the one who drove the concept of co-locating a genetics institute with the Children's Hospital. Now, many others have since made remarkably generous contributions to the Murdoch Children's Research Institute. But without the passion that was sparked in that knitting whiz of a teenager, I think the MCRI would not be what it is today. The largest child health research institute in the country and a world-class centre of genetics research and clinical genetics services. I think we can go further and say that without Dame Elisabeth's enormous contribution, I doubt that the biomedical research precinct in Parkville could have grown into the concentrated hub of world-class bioscience it is now, some 30 years later. Today, the Murdoch has 1,900 staff located at the very heart of that precinct. Its researchers work with partners within the Royal Children's Hospital and experts from the University of Melbourne on some of the most complex issues in paediatric medicine, from allergies and anaesthesia to stem cells and skeletal biology. We've just been on an official visit in India, and one of the main things they wanted to talk to us about in the health sphere was our wonderful children's hospital and the Murdoch. And I've just come back from a couple of days' official visit in Hong Kong. Again, they were talking to us about those particular services. We are known for being at the forefront of that research. It's a wonderful thought that not only do they study the diseases in the lab at the Murdoch, but they can then translate that work into more accurate diagnosis and better treatments for children. Even into the last years of her life, Dame Elisabeth remained a frequent visitor to the Institute, and she's still recalled with tremendous respect and affection by the researchers and the specialists there, because she showed a real curiosity for their work. Just as she'd said to Andrew Denton, it wasn't a matter of just writing a cheque. She genuinely cared about the work. She wanted to know about the work, and that was so motivating for those working there. What's extraordinarily striking about Dame Elisabeth's philanthropy is how it covers such a wide range of community wellbeing. She was involved in lots of causes, some of them, not even fashionable or popular at the time, like prisoner welfare and substance abuse and mental illness, well before it was something that we spoke about in the appropriate, comfortable terms that we do today. But this morning, I want to highlight her contribution to regional projects, in particular the Shepperton National Piano Award, that's held in Northern Victoria every 2 years. Now, as the awards patron-in-chief, I trust you won't mind me taking this opportunity in a room full of generous benefactors, just to give it a little special mention. But I've chosen it because I think it shows the reach that you can have if you have the vision that Dame Elisabeth showed. In the early 1990s, Shepperton arts enthusiasts began working on a plan to create a major piano competition. They appealed for a foundation gift from Dame Elisabeth, and they duly received one. What they hadn't counted on is that they weren't just getting her cheque, they were getting Dame Elisabeth too, as I said. She was well into her 80s at the time, and the piano competition was held several hours' drive from her home at Cruden Farm, but her enthusiasm wasn't bridled by that. There she was at the official launch of the award, asking questions of the young pianists, charming the locals, and there she was at every award finals performance she could possibly get to over the next decade. Dame Elisabeth was quite simply modelling what she espoused, that, again, it's not just about giving away money, you've got to give yourself. But it's also, this one example is so much about her vision, her ability to see possibilities, to be prepared to take a risk and to have faith in the energy and the idea of others. For most of its history, I think it's fair to say, and Shepperton wouldn't mind me saying, Shepperton hasn't been a place generally associated with world-class musical performance. It's not the thing that springs to mind instantly. But now, thanks to Dame Elisabeth and to the passionate organisers that she backed, and of course many other generous donors and supporters since, it very much is a centre of wonderful musical performance. Thousands of people have now had the pleasure of hearing brilliant young Australian pianists playing the most demanding classical repertoire, barely an apricot stone's throw away from the country's busiest orchards. And who knows what the flow-on effects have been or will be in the future. Who knows if one day a small, bored child, perhaps dragged along to a recital on a $10 ticket, whether that child might experience a thrilling, life-changing encounter with classical music, or perhaps she already has. It's a lovely thought. I've spoken of two outstanding philanthropists and how they've influenced Victoria's cultural, community and scientific assets. But others of our outstanding assets have been the result of collective philanthropic efforts. Some of you in this room will be familiar with the Churchill Memorial Trust. I'm extremely fortunate to have been one of the 4,000 or so Australians who've experienced the life-changing opportunity to explore new skills and ideas on a trip abroad, having been awarded a Churchill Travelling Fellowship. There may be others in the room, and I know there are certainly people who've done a lot of volunteering work for Churchill, such as Sandra Hacker in the front row. We've stood shoulder to shoulder many times, trying to select perfection from perfection because all the applications are so good. Those fellowships have been made possible by the collective philanthropic vision of many people, and it's a fascinating story. It started in 1962 when the Duke of Edinburgh was tasked to inquire of Sir Winston as to what type of memorial he'd like so that the world could remember him. Talk about vision. Sir Winston suggested something like the Rhodes Scholarships, but available to all people and on a much wider basis. And just to pause there, for any of you who don't know the fellowships, that's exactly what they are. You don't have to have any particular educational background, you don't have to be any particular age, there are no strictures at all, except that your project is one that will help enhance the lives of Australians, and that you, the candidate, are the person who can do that. So it's just the most wonderful, wide-open fellowship, travelling fellowship. So how did they bring it about? Well, thorough planning then occurred in secret because Sir Winston was still well and truly alive at the time, so that upon his death on the 24th of January 1965, a nationwide appeal for funds was launched by Prime Minister Robert Menzies immediately, with Sir William Kilpatrick as the chairman of the appeal committee. The RSL brilliantly planned and executed a nationwide door knock on what became known as Churchill Memorial Sunday, Sunday the 28th of February 1965, just a matter of weeks after Churchill had passed away. They collected the equivalent of more than $1.8 million door to door. By the time the contributions and pledges from the Commonwealth and state governments, Australian companies, institutions and individual philanthropists had been collected, the appeal target had been more than doubled, and the equivalent of nearly $4.5 million was raised. In a room full of people who understand philanthropy, I understand that it might just sound like fundraising, which is of course something different. But given the detailed vision behind it, I think it was definitely philanthropic, albeit based on an early version of crowdsourced funding, in a sense. The idea of the trust was to create a fund that could empower these Australians, as I said, from all walks of life, to change their communities for the better. It's an Australian story, not just a Victorian story, I have to admit. But Prime Minister Menzies was Victorian, and Sir William Kilpatrick at least adopted Victoria as his home. So from my perspective, it's got a very, very big overlay of Victoria. With the support of the Trust, countless ideas and passions have been generated into projects and programs that are now just part of our landscape. So even if you don't know about the Churchill Trust, you'd know about Crime Stoppers, for example, completely born of a Churchill Fellowship. At the Royal Children's Hospital, we have the world-leading GATE clinic for children who have issues and need either conservative or surgical interventions for their disabilities. And Victoria's donor tissue bank can trace its origins directly to a Churchill Fellowship. They're just a few of many examples. If I tell you that mine was about reducing cost and delay in the criminal justice system, you might think not all of them succeed, but that's a different issue. I'm sure it's better than before I went on my fellowship. The point of all this is that through the philanthropic vision of the founders of the Trust, across half a century and several different generations, the fruits of these fellowships have been able to evolve to meet changing community needs, expectations and ideas. So people would go away now to study things that couldn't have been thought of 50 years ago. And that's the very point I still say, I think, of philanthropy. It just sustains through all the other changes around it. Like all good philanthropists, I think those Churchill Trust founders truly created a gift that keeps on giving. So let me start to draw to a close by saying to you, I think there's no doubt that the example of our great philanthropists has inspired and continues to inspire many other Victorians to give and to consider philanthropy an essential part of a life well lived. As we travel to different parts of Victoria, as we're lucky to do all the time now, we see that spirit played out at the community level. We are repeatedly struck by the willingness of ordinary Victorians to contribute money or goods, their talents, their time, whatever it takes to things that they value in their communities. Now again, I know that strictly speaking, volunteerism and local fundraising are not the same as philanthropy, but I think they spring from the same source, from the same desire to build stronger communities and from that shared faith that together we can achieve the things that matter to us all. We also see people with the big ideas, with vision and a commitment to the greater good, and I can give countless examples, but I want to finish by mentioning just one. And I've chosen this one because I think it's so significant but has perhaps been under-recognised in the last few weeks. It's very topical. I want to talk about an organisation called ICAN. Who's heard of ICAN? Okay. So if I told you, for those of you who haven't, and this is why I think we should be celebrating this organisation, and you're not at fault, it's been, talk about under the radar. ICAN, the acronym stands for the International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons. It started with a launch here in Melbourne in 2007, and national campaigns have now been organised off the back of that in dozens of countries in every region of the world. Why am I focusing on this little organisation? Because it has just won the Nobel Peace Prize for 2017. I asked someone yesterday why there's been so little publicity, and the answer was both frustrating but heartwarming. It's because they don't have a big media machine. They actually put their funding where it needs to go. So again, with big hearts in the room, it's one to really have some thought about. It's extraordinary. Now, I'm not suggesting that ICANN dates its origins only to Victoria, but Melbourne was absolutely instrumental in its founding days. And although the original and the continuing fundraising for ICANN in Victoria has been modest compared to, say, the might of the Felton bequest, it's still been driven by the same values as the philanthropy of Felton, Murdoch or the Churchill Trust. The philanthropic commitment of the people behind ICANN is to the common good, driven by the belief that all of us have it in our power to make things better for others, and that giving in whatever way we can is just that essential part of life. I know that ethos is not unique to Victoria, but earlier generations of Victorians who were so determined to build a more just, inclusive and compassionate society bequeathed to us, I think, not only our libraries and museums, free kindergartens and gorgeous parks, but most importantly, I think they bequeathed to us a sense of ourselves as a participatory community, an in-it-together society of contributors. The philanthropic ethos, that personal commitment to the common good, is our patrimony. It's the inheritance of all Victorians, and we can be very grateful, and hopefully we can all be inspired to contribute to that patrimony for future generations. And I think that that's how we can best ensure that we live up to our state motto of peace and prosperity. Thank you.